Hey, everybody. Welcome to episode 40 of Radio Free Ortona. Sorry for the long wait. It's been about a month and a bit since our last one. And only 2 decades worth of things have happened in that month. But we're not going to talk about that because these two jackasses want to talk about the Spanish Civil War.
We will talk about it just after.
They assure me that it's relevant to our current political time.
100%.
So I'm going to challenge you. Your guys' goal here is to educate me and teach me.
Okay.
Not debating among yourselves.
Okay.
Well, you're probably going to debate among yourselves because you can't help yourselves. But, all right, Patty, go!
Okay, so
Why does he get to go first?
because I'm not
he's
the
on my right.
enthusiast. Yeah, exactly.
person on
'Cause
your
I'm on the
right.
right. Yeah, the person on your right. Yeah, it's like a stop sign.
Yeah.
So it's good. Don't think of spectrum. Think traffic.
This is bullshit.
Okay. So, what we want to talk about is we were talking about when does the left go too far, or when has the left has its reach overextended its grasp, and so then we got to thinking, okay, let's look at Republican Spain, 1931 to 1936, and the reforms that were made in a very egregious situation. And there's a lot of general agreement, for better or for worse, and we're going to get into that those reforms were very, very benign and for the general good. And if we can look at that and say, okay, this is a zenith, this is kind of a high watermark of what the left can achieve in good for society. So let's examine that and then superimpose that on today and see if we discern any differences.
I agree in that. I think that's great because on the one hand, I've found that whenever the concept of the Spanish Civil War has come up, that is where we have found some very, very common ground in terms of what it is actually quote unquote good versus bad. At the same time, the Spanish experience is relevant to all sorts of examples. Right now, in its own way, it's relevant to Ukraine. In its own way, it's relevant to and the immediate, the interwar period or the the build up to the Second World War and the so-called appeasement. It's also relevant to the causes of, right now Gaza is kind of the left.
Cause célèbre.
Yeah, the cause célèbre. Exactly, right? So, in so many ways, and then, we're going to start picking this stuff apart. So I am very interested in going with this. It's interesting. We said Spanish Civil War, but you actually just mentioned we're going to look at 31 through 36, which is the beginning of the war. And I think that is actually relevant.
I don't want to look too much at the battles.
No.
Like the war itself, I don't think is really relevant.
Right.
But what the actions of the Republican government,
Right.
in largely the pre-war era,
Yeah.
that's what I think. That's what I really find interesting here, and I want to have you go through what you think were those really fundamental reforms, and then let's look at the principles behind them.
So actually, it's more about the principles for me, and it's that history. So it's less about what the reforms were as opposed to the issues.
Yeah, what are the
that they
principles
came out
motivated
of, right?
Yeah,
And that and I've had to do some scurrying to bone up on this stuff because I know all about the war, but not so much the politics that preceded that. So I've been reading up on that in the last 24 hours, and basically it goes back 100 years, and it was the failure of Spanish society to keep up with the rest of Western Europe in terms of modernization of its politics to go along with the modernization of economics, right? Which was happening everywhere else. And so you ended up with this growing disenfranchised and therefore disaffected working class, both in terms of the peasantry and then the industrial workers. And again, for me, the power base that or the holding of power in the latifundas.
Just for you mean like the landowning?
The
class.
landowning
The
class.
landowning nobility,
Right.
Yeah, just for folks who maybe aren't familiar with Spain.
That's the only word I'm going to drop in this because it's the only one I can remember.
Yeah.
It was that. That's something you and I butt heads on a lot. So now when I talk about the 0.1%, in modern terms, it's that same amount of power. And you're saying, well, and so this is the dichotomy for me. This is the paradox when I talk to you, is that and that's why I want to talk about Spain. When we talk about that holding of power in these exclusive hands in Spain from, say, 1830 through 1930, to me, there's a lot of similarities to Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk and all the big billionaires who own shit tons of power. And on the one hand, you seem to agree that the peasants and the workers in Spain at that time, that was not an acceptable situation. But you're okay with Elon Musk, it's his money, he can do whatever the fuck he wants with it, right? So that's where I see a lot of that crossover. But basically, yeah. So you had the church, you had the army, to a certain extent, propping it up. The church benefiting from power and control
of what?
Of the masses.
Okay.
It just control over people's
How is
behavior,
this control
right?
manifested?
Well, the church, the way it's always been, right? And one of the things I read, and I can't exactly place it, but there was a shift in the structure of the church and the application of the church, in that it went away from what I'll loosely call a beneficial model, in that it had social programs that came with it and stuff like that, and it went to a very hierarchical, repressive model in Spain. In the years prior to 31.
You mean like a very fundamentalist Catholicism?
Yeah, and it was about controlling the people and guiding
but,
them away from certain things as opposed to others.
And just to, I'm not contesting this.
Yeah.
I just want to kind of tease more detail out of you.
Yep.
They didn't have the power of the state, though. There was no church police. The church had no army. It had no option. It had no recourse to force. So how could it enforce its power?
Well, I mean, religion is religion. It's always been that way, organized religion. When you're exerting that kind of... There's a control that comes with that.
Sure.
If you're talking about God and going to hell...
Yeah. So it was a moral authority, not necessarily a legal authority.
Oh, exactly. Oh, no. Right. There's not a lot of legality in it, although it was very, very, very much entrenched with the political system. So it had, it was very much in bed with the monarchy.
Well, there was a lot of functions that the church handled,
yeah,
that the state had no mechanism for, and I think we're going to get into that.
I'm sure.
All right. So,
do you think there's any parallels, or not a parallel, like a legacy from the church in like the 15th century? Because the Inquisition, I was just listening to a podcast about this. It was actually about...
no one expected it.
You never expected that.
You knew that was coming.
Depends on which Inquisition we're talking.
Yeah. No, but Martyr Maid was doing a bit, and it was actually about anti-Semitism. It was he called it, because he's doing two projects at once right now. He's working on an anti-Semitism program, and he's working on a thing about the slave trade. And so it was at an interesting crossroads of Spain at the end of the 15th century, right? Columbus lands in the New World, they discover it. The transatlantic slave trade starts, and the Inquisition starts. because it's almost right at the end of the Reconquista, right? Like they cemented the end of the Reconquista.
Yep.
And then, but the thing was that when the Moors controlled Spain, and this happens like most places that Jews go, Jews maintain throughout the diaspora like essentially transnational networks of commerce and trade.
Yeah.
Right. And so the Moors, and wherever they go, they end up being middlemen in society. And in early episodes, Cooper's pointed out, like, okay, well, this is also the Han Chinese throughout South Pacific, and it's Indians especially on the east coast of Africa, right?
And the British Empire.
Yeah, and the British Empire.
Yep.
But all these places, these people with these, whether it's Han Chinese, Indians, or Jews, end up being the middlemen in society.
Right.
And usually in these places, it's like there's the top, middlemen do pretty good, and then everybody
and then
below
the peasantry underneath.
And it's peasantry, and it's serfs and peasantry and that kind of crap.
Yeah.
Right? So after the Reconquista, the peasantry really becomes like the Jews have, other than the royalty monarchy, because the monarchy is reestablished. Jews have the most wealth.
Right.
So then,
If you, in terms of, say, liquidity.
yeah.
Absolutely. Whereas real wealth is measured in land, and the Jews never had access to that.
So
they had to find that niche.
Yeah, they had to find, exactly.
Yeah. You can't be a peasant unless you're on the land.
Right. So then the king, they passed a law saying, okay, well, Jews either got to convert or leave.
So they leave?
Some of them leave, some of them convert. Right? And they call them conversos.
Sure.
And that's when the trouble starts.
Right.
Because the conversos. So a bunch of them pack up and go to Portugal. And then, but the richest ones stay, become conversos. And then that's when the Inquisition starts, because they're still easily identifiable.
Right.
And then, the king gets authorization from the Pope for the Inquisition because he thinks these conversos are still practicing Judaism.
Right.
Right? And so that's the whole thing. And so Cooper points out that this is the really interesting part. If the Jews who don't convert, don't fall under the jurisdiction of the Inquisition.
Right.
It's only the Jews who converted, right?
Who converted, yeah.
And so, but that's the church with the law enforcement. I mean, and horrors abound, and right, and that through the church. I mean, with the state's sanction, obviously.
Well, you see, the church has to convince the state to lend its muscle.
To an extent. I mean,
Because the church has no, like as Stalin said, like the Pope. How many divisions does the Pope have? Like we scoffed at the power of the Catholic Church. Like,
well,
how
at the
many
Catholic
divisions does he have?
the Catholic Church at that time.
Well,
yeah, so it depends on when you're talking.
Well, if we're
Right.
talking about the Papal States in Italy, but we're
Yes.
not. We're talking about Spain in the 1930s and the immediate prior.
The Catholic Church is like responsible for, like, kill them all, let God sort them out. Is from 14th century French battle where the Catholics.
That was during the Albigensian Crusades in the Pyrenees
Yeah.
against the Cathars.
Yes. And it was basically because they were heretics in the eyes of the Catholic Church.
Yes.
And the actual line is like, well, how will we just, the
God
line
will
is,
know his own.
kill them all, God
Yeah.
will know his own. Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly.
But my point is that the church relies on moral authority.
I would actually dispute that to a certain in the time period. And you've opened so many cans of worms now. I don't even know where to begin. But since Patty's taken it in this direction, under papal authority in medieval, late medieval, early Renaissance times, there were such things as religious tribunals, right? So that they had an authority of their own.
No, they always had to convince the state to lend them muscle.
It was.
And I think there's some politics that
in the
play
case
into
of
that.
the
Well,
Spanish,
I mean-
the Spanish and the Portuguese Inquisitions, especially the Portuguese Inquisition, which I guess made the Spanish one look like a bunch of peace-loving amateurs. That was the king going to the Pope, trying to establish the Inquisition himself.
Right.
So it was.
It was in that case, it was the state using the church for legitimacy
and
for boring the. There's a two-way traffic here.
Yeah.
The church, with its moral authority, goes to the state and says, "Hey, lend me your legal authority." And then the state will sometimes go to the church and say, "Hey, I want to kick down some doors and beat people up. Can you lend me your moral authority to justify it?"
Yeah.
So yeah, there was definitely a traffic here. Like there was a Congress.
And I don't
But
want
they are still two separate institutions.
They are.
And
Yeah,
that
absolutely,
must not
yeah.
be confused.
Yeah, but I don't want to downplay the power
They did have power.
of the moral authority.
Absolutely. But it must be recognized that is what it is.
Anyway, that digression is just because I want to curious, like what kind of legacy that leaves in to us in
Well, there's
1931, right?
There's
I
no
don't know.
question
I
because
have no idea, to be honest.
once the Civil War begins, and to a certain extent leading into it, but once you start seeing the propaganda coming out of the nationalists, right, the rebels, it's all it evokes the Reconquista the whole time, the whole way through.
Yep.
And you're absolutely right. 1490 to 1492 is actually the year of the Reconquista. That's when they finally take Granada back, which is the last bastion.
Last fall. Yeah.
The Moors.
And again, so many things that we've discussed up to this point. What does Franco and the Phalangists? The nationalists? What do they hate? Well, they hate the Jews, they hate Freemasons, and they hate communists, right? Because these are all things that are ultra nationalist, right? As you spoke about, the Jews have this.
Or pan-nationalist.
Pan-nationalist.
Internationalist.
Yeah.
International.
So they don't trust these things. I always find the Freemasons is a very interesting thing. Like fascists hate Freemasons.
It's weird how many groups hate Freemasons.
Because they are also pan-nationalists.
I guess,
So they've got loyalty to something that is greater than
outside
the state.
the state. That's
Right?
right. Yeah.
And Spain was again very, very, very chauvinist to the extent that, and I think I've mentioned this before, that there's a battle where the Italians fighting for the nationalists get their asses handed to them by the Republicans, Spanish, and the nationalist Spanish celebrate this because they.
It was a celebration of Spaniards over, right?
Spanish beat Italians, so yay guys, right.
They may be dirty commies, but they're our dirty commies.
The thing that gets me, it's always gotten to me about anti-Semitism when it comes to. I don't even like using the word Jews because that sounds.
It does sound
pejorative. I like to say Jewish people.
Yeah, same here. I don't know why, but I have that same.
Because I just don't want to come across as that, right? And it's people of Jewish blood, of Jewish faith, of Jewish background. Christians were not allowed to dabble in usury. They couldn't charge interest.
Neither a borrower nor a lender be.
Jewish people could. And therefore, it fell to them to do that, right? And look at that. They're the ones accumulating a whole bunch of wealth as a result of that. And that's... And I always look at that and go, guys, you're the ones who set up these rules.
Well, that was because when those rules were built, when those rules were made, the mathematics was extremely primitive. They didn't understand the concept of compound interest.
Right.
Whereas, you needed an evolution in mathematics for that to take place.
Yeah, but I mean that's very logical and rational. That explains how the wealth was accumulated. But again, it was this moral constraint that in order to be a good Christian, you can't do this, right? Yeah, and therefore, and now we're blaming them for being wealthy, right? When we're the ones who created this, the circumstances.
Well, that's not
the
new.
Conditions for that. Oh, I know.
That's not new. I mean, we do that today. We can. I mean, look at the UK today. They have a culture that automatically assumes all wealth is ill-gotten. That's just British, especially Scotland. That's just their culture.
And that's a Scot speaking.
Well, background anyway.
Well, I was listening to something else this week. I can't remember who it was, and they pointed out. People think England or the UK is a wealthy country.
It's not.
It's no, but they're like, no, London's a wealthy city.
I heard that same podcast. It was, the Lotus Eaters, wasn't it?
No, it wasn't Lotus Eaters because I don't listen to that one. But,
okay.
What the hell was it? It doesn't matter.
Anyway,
but it was London's a wealthy city. The rest of the place is a poor country.
Yeah.
Right? Like a massively overregulated poor country.
Well, and that's why it's poor. Right. But at any rate, okay, give me some of these reforms and principles.
I don't know what they are.
Okay, I got
Honestly,
a couple.
I know in general what they are. There was
I got a couple.
there was land reform.
I got a couple. So, Agrarian Reform Law of 1932.
Okay.
Let's go back to another one. The Law of Municipal Boundaries
Okay.
outlawed the employment of workers. No, let's go to Agrarian Reform Law of 1932. Let's go to that one first because I think it's a broader base.
Okay.
We're not doing this chronologically. This was the most radical of the Spanish agricultural reforms. It aimed to solve the problem of rural poverty by redistributing land to peasants. Landowners were allowed to keep up to 23 hectares of land. Anything over this could be bought by the state and given to peasants in the hope that they could farm themselves out of poverty. Now, this was not well done. It was poorly written. It threatened small landholders, even more than the large estates.
Right.
And at the end of the day, only 12,000 families, or 10% of applicants, actually received land because of the massive amounts of red tape that
I can see the red tape being an
around
issue. Right?
around this thing. So, principle.
Well,
What is the principle behind that?
Well, there was a very, very, very impoverished peasantry,
Yep.
and they were essentially exploited by the landowners to work the lands. They had no rights. They had no, they were overworked. It's your typical scenario. There was child labor. There was no safety measures. They were overworked.
Can
underpaid.
I back you up? I'm sorry.
Back me up?
I started with the wrong one.
Okay.
This was much more complex.
Okay.
Let me go to something really dirt simple. Women given the franchise. Women given the right to vote.
Yeah.
Give me a principle. What's the principle behind that?
I mean, okay.
Sometimes the blatantly obvious is the hardest to articulate.
Well, at the risk of, I don't even want to go here, but the simplest thing is what Trudeau the Younger said in 2015, because it's 2015, because it's 1930 whatever. Women should be given the right to vote.
So is that a desire for equality before the law? Is that to say no governance without the consent of the governed?
Yeah, in both those cases.
Both of those, okay.
Right, and
What else
not
can we
just
say?
equality in the eyes of the law, the equality in the eyes of society.
Okay, so equality before the state, or
Before society, the society is not.
Okay.
I will draw
Even
a
without the
distinction.
state?
I will draw a distinction between society and state.
okay,
Right.
okay.
It's like as a people, Spaniards were saying, our women are equal.
So it's like I'm putting words in your mouth, and I want you to stop me if I get too far.
Yeah.
We are emphasizing the humanity of these people, and that we are not verifying, but we are validating the humanity here.
Which are two very powerful statements. The last two things you just said, right? Because I find that if we go back, to me, it's just the concepts of revolution, the big revolutions, the American Revolution, the documents that came with that, the things that are said, the French Revolution, the Emancipation Proclamation, the Gettysburg Address, right? They all have these very powerful, laudable statements that are completely hypocritical in the ultimate application that follows them. And at the same time, so what you talk about validation, yes, we are validating this humanity that has somehow been missed and never should have been missed. Especially when you consider in so many ways that there are these paradoxes along the way when patriarchy versus matriarchy, there are respectful roles in some ways ascribed to women in their own right, even under those systems. So the whole concept of not validating so much as having to validate, and that extends from women to peasants to industrial workers.
That's the next one.
Right.
Steve, Have we missed a principle there?
Well, I was going to ask a question.
Okay.
I accept it as a truth. Breitbart statement. Politics is downstream from culture.
Okay.
So, every time, no matter how just the cause, and I will concede, I shouldn't say concede, it's probably not a great word, but
I accept
No.
accept your use of the word. Because I'm never going to hear this ever again.
I concede that legislating the franchise to women is a good cause. But if the culture's not ready for it, you're going to have suboptimal results.
Okay. But again, let's not talk so much. Well, I guess we could. But what I want to understand right now is, again, principles. Because, again, I want to try and distill down why, the intent. And then maybe later on we can superimpose that upon the society of today.
If I may, so here's what occurred to me when you went to Steve on this.
Yeah.
Right? Because Steve's the libertarian.
Yeah.
Right? The one thing I didn't mention is the rights of the individual. Is that what you were getting at? Is that why you turned to Steve?
No, actually, I wasn't thinking of that. I just thought
Okay.
he might have something that we hadn't covered yet.
Okay.
Did I? No, but yeah, I was just that was my first thought. Is just that if the society and like you're talking about the agrarian law being very very poorly written, and so every time and
poorly executed.
and poorly
Yeah,
executed.
poorly executed.
Like okay, so that's something that really that really reflects our modern experience, right? Like.
Well, yeah, absolutely. So actually, now
because we were talking in text earlier this week about how like our government here is basically in their almost 9 years into their mandate and have basically not been able to implement anything.
True.
I can't believe that I'm about to say the words that. I mean, you said you just quoted someone from Breitbart.
Well, Breitbart himself.
Yeah.
Okay, so I love that statement that politics is downstream from culture because we've been seeing that since 2015, no question.
Yeah, Breitbart said that like in 2002.
Yep.
Right, but
Yeah. No, it's definitely true.
and then,
But, yeah.
funnily enough, when we're talking about the execution of the policy,
Yeah.
now that's downstream from politics, right? So now we've got it at both ends.
Well, it's just that the culture is way upstream.
Yeah,
And so the proper way of things is that legislation should be a lagging indicator of where culture is. Because then the people are ready for the legislation when it comes.
Well,
Ideally.
Ideally.
well, I
Ideally.
think there's no getting away from the fact that we've got a century
So when we got
of
it,
culture
Yeah.
feeding into what happens in Spain in 1931 and onwards.
yeah.
Yeah. So following that, just to set the table, Largo Caballero, the Minister of Labor.
Yeah.
Ringing any bells?
Something
You've
came
heard the
up.
name? Okay. His focus was largely on rural workers. That was he was concerned about urban workers, but just out of he devoted more of his bureaucratic horsepower towards helping out the rural peasantry, and it was a bad situation. Just a background for the listeners here, and maybe Steve getting educated here. Common 16-hour days were commonplace. Most workers, of course, agricultural labor, seasonally employed. So they would be paid during the agricultural year, and then once the harvest came in, there was no pay.
Yeah.
And it was often not enough to get them through the months when they were unemployed or underemployed. Right. So one of the reforms was an introduction of an 8-hour work day principle.
Well, I mean, it's the same, what's acceptable, now we're talking standard of living from a quality of life point of view, right? It's separation of work and home.
So we're saying that like I said, I'm trying to draw something out of you. So there is a dignity, or not dignity, there is
I think that's a great word.
separation between, or it's okay. So this is part of the dignity of the individual?
I'd say so.
Can we draw any I'm throwing something against the wall here. Guys, tell me if this sticks. Can we draw comparisons between this and slavery?
Probably. In the Spanish context,
Yes. In this context
Yes.
of indentured, or not indentured, but laborers who are, in a way, poverty kind of holds them, really, really, really limits their options.
right. So
They can't just up and leave, and I mean, some can, but a lot can't.
right. So I think it doesn't matter if you call it slavery or
Yeah.
indentured servitude, right?
Yeah.
In whatever dictionary terms they are, either way, that's what's at play, right? And again, I'm taking that and bringing it into the modern context, and this is why I'm loving having this conversation, because I feel a lot of that is happening right now. We talk a lot about the market governing who people are going to work for, who people are going to buy from, but to me that is a very sliding scale. And using Spain as the example is absolutely correct, because it is the practical equivalent of slavery or indentured servitude. Either way you look at it, they are powerless to be in any other situation than the one that they are in.
I'm going to be devil's advocate.
Okay.
What's wrong with slavery?
What's wrong with slavery?
What's the moral case against slavery?
Okay.
Why do we think that's wrong?
Coming from, so me speaking to, I mean, I got libertarian on one hand, and on the other hand,
Say like-
every conversation you and I have had has been, from your point of view,
Yep.
rooted in individual rights.
Yep.
Exclusively, 100%, that is the starting point. Right?
Imagine I was from the Persian Empire,
Yes,
and I've never known a world without slavery.
right,
And it's an indispensable part of my societal organization.
right.
So how would you explain that to me? To say that, no, slavery is wrong on a moral basis.
Well, I mean, I don't know if I could.
Steve, I know you can. What is the moral case against slavery?
The moral case of slavery. Well, okay, against slavery.
Against slavery.
So, from the libertarian perspective, right? The fundamental basis of all rights is the rights of the individual, and so, how do I describe this? How do I face this argument? One, the slave is held against his will. Okay, so that's the immediate and primary violation of his rights. Okay, two. The slave owner is essentially stealing the labor.
No one may be alienated from their labor.
Right.
There you go. Can we agree on that? That is the moral case against slavery.
Absolutely.
Okay.
But so maybe I misunderstood your question, but I took it from, I cannot morally argue with you if that's your mindset. I'm not going to convince you. I can say words to you.
Yeah.
But if you have no context for them, then they're just going to go. I'm
So
speaking
there's-
Swahili. To
Yeah, there's two principles
Just
here
that
that we talked about.
the individual needs to. I had this and I lost it. The individual needs to have access to the fruits of his labor, or needs to receive the fruits of his labor, or whatever.
Yes.
Right.
So if you want something done, you want those fields tilled.
Yeah.
You may not compel a man to do that for you.
No.
That's morally wrong. You can say, hey, I'll compensate you.
Yes.
And that compensation must be freely agreed to.
Yes.
Not, look, I'm going to force you to do it. I'll pay you $10 a day. Quit your bitching, but you're still forced. And that labor, yes, they receive some level of compensation, but it's not a level of compensation that is agreed to or freely adhered to.
Yeah.
Nor is it commensurate to the labor involved. Well, I guess those two go hand in hand, right?
Stompin' Tom has got a song about this while working in tobacco fields, and I can't remember the name of it.
Something
Oh
similar
wow,
to that.
Stompin' Tom.
Okay, another reform.
But I have a question. I have a question.
Shoot.
The 8-hour workday.
Yep.
Because this is my always looking at the mechanics of how things work.
That was pretty progressive for the 30s. Anyway,
Yeah.
go ahead.
Was it just okay? You can't make anybody work 8 hours, or was it like there's flexibility here, but you have to compensate them more. Like, was there overtime?
The second.
Okay,
Yes.
so there was.
Because that was my next point.
I was just going to say, because like, especially when you're talking about agriculture, right? Like different parts of the agricultural season require different amounts of labor and different, so when you're harvesting and there's a storm coming, you got to get that
Another
crop
reform was that workers were given the legal right to overtime pay.
in. Right.
Now, this doesn't mean it was always instituted the same way across the board.
Yeah.
Because, there were different industries, whatever. But the point, and this is where kind of allowance was made for the anarcho-syndicalists in that it put the concept of overtime pay into the legal realm. It is something that could be negotiated. It was something that was in the legal lexicon. So yeah, that was what's the principle of that? We've got a rule 8-hour day. When we allow overtime, what's our principle there? Why do we do that?
Well, we're reinforcing the 8-hour day by saying the 8-hour day should be sacrosanct.
So we're making a concept of normalcy here.
Exactly. So if we go beyond that, if again it's mutually agreed upon, we are valuing the 8-hour day so much that anything beyond that 8-hour day, if agreed upon,
Actually, here's a question.
Yep.
is compensated that much more.
Did they say overtime pay had to be more than the standard regular pay?
Yes, but I don't have details on it.
Because I was going to say, you can make I think you can make the argument that maybe overtime pay should be less because people who are working over 8 hours are probably less efficient than they were for the previous 8 hours.
That's the whole reason for
there
not working
is
overtime.
a lot of data on that, particularly in 12-hour shifts.
Yeah.
The last 2 hours of a 12-hour shift are actually negative productivity.
Yeah.
Well, like not always, but there's a lot of research pointing in that direction. And I don't know if people were allowed, say, straight time in lieu.
Yeah.
Of overtime. I don't know.
banked
I don't
hours.
know.
That's
I don't know.
that's
I think
the
that was
workaround here that always drives me nuts.
I think that was more of a how would you say? That's a later innovation.
Yeah.
And that comes up. I think that is attached more to later, like after the 1950s, with progressive taxation.
Well, the other
I worked at a company once that did banked hours. I wasn't a fan.
No, the banked hours. That to me is
I know a lot of guys will love it because they get longer holidays and they pay less taxes.
Yeah.
sure.
So, I guess it depends. And most of those guys are tradies.
I wasn't aware we had a grammar Nazi.
Yeah, grammar Nazi. Which I was about to say.
Yeah.
Thank you for saying it.
Okay, so
But I actually have a question.
Yep.
So,
shoot.
so Steve brought up. Okay, are we saying that necessarily they were getting paid more for overtime? My question becomes: was because I was saying well, it has to be agreed upon, but maybe it wasn't. Maybe if the law was just if you go beyond those 8 hours, you have to keep working if the boss says so, but you'll get paid more. So I don't know if it was set in stone for that either.
I don't think so. I'm pretty sure Caballero would not write that in.
I do know the name Caballero, but
Yeah.
more from during the war.
Right.
He was one of the he was one of the
Yeah.
military political leaders on the left.
Okay.
Sorry, for the Republic.
Right. Which is important to note because often we associate, just because of American popular culture, right, Republican, it flips in Spain in the 30s. Okay, so there was the law of municipal boundaries. This outlawed the employment of workers from outside each municipal district. It was designed to stop the undercutting of wages through the employment of cheaper migrant labor.
Interesting.
Principle.
Well, I mean, you just outlined the principle, right? Which was to, again, maintain the effectiveness of, it's kind of a wage control. It's saying we're going to make sure the quality of life for, and the agreements, the employment agreements.
You set up labor as a cartel.
Yeah.
Kind of. Right? Because you don't want, again, now we're talking supply and demand.
Yep.
Right? Because
But then you're restricting supply.
Yes, you are.
You're restricting supply. There's no question. It's protectivism.
Yeah.
Or protectionism.
Protectionism,
right?
yeah.
So
what's the principle?
Well, it's meant to guarantee those people in that place, right?
But are we not? See, this is where this one to me is stickier.
Yeah, you're right.
I'm
for the
going
record,
from
I
the-
agree with
yeah.
you that this is sticky.
I'm going from the really hard to contest, and that's why I wanted to start with. This is why my notes are not nearly as good as I thought they were. I wanted to start with the universal franchise
Yeah,
because
pretty basic.
you're going to have to get up pretty early in the morning to make an effective argument against that.
Right.
I'm sure somebody could.
Yeah.
They're just not me. So that's really easy. But as we go further, and 8-hour workday. Now, I don't want to get off the beaten path here. I don't want to diverge on this.
I don't think there's any avoiding getting off the beaten path.
I wonder why 8 hours.
I don't know.
Why 8? It's because it's kind of universal.
I think it's always been
Is
8.
this-
So
Is
it's
this
like
where 8 hours started, or do we know where 8 hours started?
No. I believe 8 hours was already standard in other European jurisdictions. But why 8, I wonder?
And what was the Spanish structure, right? Because it probably would have been like 4 hours in the morning, say starting at 7, and probably a 2 or 3 hour break in the middle of the day.
Yes,
Oh, yeah,
I
it's
believe,
okay.
I believe they did
now
have
you
that.
want now you want to get complex.
And there was a similar function in Italy as well.
Yeah, and
in
in
like the
Greece and-
really, really hot
Yeah.
climates and this is an age without air conditioning, without climate controls.
Yeah.
So in the hottest 2 or 3 hours of the day, all commercial activity stopped.
Yeah.
Banks closed.
Yeah, tell me about it.
telegraph
So
offices closed.
40
Yeah.
years ago, like
Yeah.
today, I was traveling Europe with
Yeah.
John, and at one point we ended up in San Sebastian.
Yeah.
And I went to exchange some traveler's checks at 2 PM.
Yeah. Not happening. Yeah.
It ain't
shut down.
happening.
Yeah. Shut
right,
down.
and
Yeah.
I was blown away.
Yeah.
Like I was like, how could this be? Because Alberta had already moved on to the point where things were open on Sundays.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
we've never looked back.
Maybe it's because when you factor in that break in the middle of the day, we're talking about a 10, 12-hour day of commerce.
Yeah.
Like the commercial day is, and take this aside from your laborers. Set those guys aside for a moment. Laws and such, your managerial class doesn't get much of a break. They're still responsible. They're still planning. They're still kind of mentally, they're on the job.
Yeah.
That's like a 10, 12-hour day. Maybe,
Yeah, they're taking TSs.
sure they are, but it's different. If my only job is to dig the shovel, or is to pick up a shovel and dig a hole, that's very easy to take a break from. If my job is to supervise 100 holes being dug, that's harder. That's more mentally taxing. So maybe that's why they kind of said, look, 8 hours, because you're factoring in
Yeah.
break, meal, whatever, right?
Yeah.
It's tough to call, but I mean, now you're talking lifestyle as well, because
Yeah.
I've seen this in Greece, Italy to a certain extent, and Spain for sure, where you're going out to eat later, right?
Yeah.
You wait until it gets dark,
Yeah.
so you're finishing work later.
Yeah, it could be.
It's more of a social thing to go out for dinner. You go out for dinner, or you have dinner, and that's happening later in the day. You're not getting as much sleep, maybe. Like I can tell you, when I was on Crete, I was looking for nightclubs, right? And I was wandering around 10 at night, nothing. The whole place was dead, right? And I wandered around literally for 2 hours, midnight. I'm walking back to the hotel, and I hear noise. And it was one of the places I walked past, and they didn't open until midnight, right? And this was on a weeknight.
Yeah.
This is what they do.
Yeah.
Right. And I've seen that in other places as well. So that's actually complicating the answer I was going to give to the 8-hour day, which is this, right? It's easy to break it up because I think this is generally where the concept comes from. But I have nothing to base this on. 1/3 of the day is work.
Yeah.
1/3 of the day is sleep because we've always gone with this 8-hour thing.
Yep.
Whereas,
Yeah. 24 hours in a day.
right.
Yeah.
And so the other 8 hours is to be conscious
Yeah.
and not working.
Well, also, you have other responsibilities.
Yeah.
Child rearing, maintenance of the home, mending clothing, what have you. Okay. Can someone make comments on is there a place where a listener could make comments or something?
Yep,
with our
they can
stuff?
comment on the podcast.
Okay, so Corey, you're the only guy I know is listening to this. Give us a comment. Tell us why. Give us your thoughts. Okay, so beyond that, to get back onto the thing here.
That doesn't mean no one else can.
No, they can't. They won't. They just don't care.
Challenge accepted.
So this law of municipal boundaries, much stickier.
Yeah.
Because now we're talking about we're putting our hand on the scale.
Yes, we are.
So from the libertarian perspective, that's a complete non-starter. Right? In a libertarian government would never do this.
Why?
Okay.
Why? What's the principle?
Well, because multiple principles. People may wish, as individuals, to move from where there's no work to where there is work. Right? And they should be allowed to. And employers should be able to employ who they want. And people should be able to work for who they want. And the government shouldn't put their hands on the scale because it fucks shit up.
Trent, tell him why he's wrong.
I won't be so arrogant as to declare Steve wrong.
I'll
tell him why I disagree with him.
I want you to be inflammatory. I want you to just, oh my goodness.
So, as I've often said,
He's too much of a gentleman. God damn. Too much of a gentleman.
is there such a thing? Truly, too much?
Sorry, I'm trying to be provocative.
Too
I'm
much of
failing
a gentleman.
miserably. Please go on.
I'll take it. So on the one hand, I think there's a natural tendency or predilection on the part of capitalists to go, I'm going to leverage whatever I can to keep my costs down, right? And therefore they are going to, I'll use the word abuse that situation to their benefit and to the detriment of their current workers. So that's the reason for trying to protect the current workers. Am I agreeing with the system in principle? Yes, for the protection, its application, again, its execution, maybe not so much.
So
right?
you're saying that, it's sticky.
It's
not,
sticky. I understand the intent.
It's not it's not a slam dunk.
Right. And this is why, and whenever we butt heads about capitalism, this is what I'm talking about, right? I find an interesting take on this is, okay, Mr. Libertarian. So I hear that Somalia is a very dry and arid place, and it doesn't have a lot of resources and has quite the population, and a lot of them might want to be somewhere else to be gainfully employed and make a living and provide for their families and stuff like that. Why should they not just be allowed to cross borders and get a job wherever they want?
Because there's a dialogue here. If you're going to just go wherever you want, you have to have the consent of the person whose home you are traversing.
Right, now we're getting that to me is another sticky concept, right? So it depends on how we define these things.
Law of municipal boundaries works both ways. So, for example, let's say there is no more employment within my municipality.
Yeah.
We have a surplus of labor.
Yes.
I need to go somewhere else to work.
Yeah.
But I can't.
Right.
Because I am captured within my municipality.
So the obvious, to me, analogy I'm going to use at this point is we're exchanging the concept of municipal boundaries for national borders.
Yep.
Right? Somalis can't cross
Freely
the border
transit,
into Ethiopia or Kenya. I'm trying to remember all the
Or
other nations
Ethiopia,
that border,
Eritrea, or Somaliland.
right?
Yeah.
They can't just do that. So in a lot of ways, we're talking apples and apples in my view.
Yeah. It's a
right?
double-edged sword. Definitely.
So, and again, we're talking that same supply and demand. And I have a lot of sympathy for the people who are moving around. So, and again, this conversation, this is why I say that there's no getting away from we're going to end up all over the place here, right? The slavery analogy is actually one I loved, right? Because there are at least two conversations that come with the fact, okay, well, slavery in the first place, look at ancient Rome. Slavery actually undercut the economy and created unemployment.
The antebellum Southern America, the antebellum states of the southern United States.
Yeah.
Slavery absolutely held their economy back. Absolutely, without question.
Right, and yet the reason for fighting for it was to maintain that.
Well, it,
Right.
it benefited a very small agrarian landowning class, but like that small group of people benefited greatly from it. But of course, that's why there was no industry in the South.
Yeah.
You know, slavery. In the same way that you could make the argument that the agricultural industry in California has been held back by the ability to use this infinite supply of virtual slave labor,
Yeah.
of cheap, easily exploitable labor.
Which is
It's kept California agriculture inefficient and poorly productive.
which I find very ironic, given that California is such a left-leaning state in so
Yes,
many
it is.
ways.
Yeah.
To have that be, and that's been going on for decades,
Yeah.
like generations.
Yep. Okay, so how about can we get stickier here?
Yeah, absolutely. That's your job.
The law, still with Caballero, the law of obligatory cultivation. I'm going to say that again because that word is fun. The law of obligatory cultivation.
Obligatory?
Yeah, I say obligatory.
Obligatory.
Obligatory?
Obligatory. Wow. This is good time.
Obligatory is actually better than your original.
Yes. Land had to be used for arable purposes, or it could be confiscated by the state. The idea behind this reform was to increase food production and create job opportunities in rural areas where unemployment was often high and malnutrition was a national problem.
Whoa. Okay. Heavy-handed.
Yeah. And lots of room for this to go wrong. Or lots of room
It's
for
almost
the
Marxist.
law. Well, yeah.
Right?
Duh.
Hang on.
But there's
whoa,
also
whoa,
room.
whoa.
There's also room for the law of unintended consequences.
Oh, lots.
Lots. Yeah.
Yeah, let's not get on the red under my bed bandwagon quite
well,
yet.
just saying though that there was a great deal of influence, and this would complicate things later on. And I do think it needs to come into the conversation.
Right.
That radical elements of the left did
Yeah.
have influence on what, like Caballero was not living on an island.
Right.
He had to take input from across the coalition that was Republican Spain.
I would say that in any society,
Mm-hmm.
under any state, any government, if there is an extreme need, like if there is
Mm-hmm.
extreme, not just poverty, but starvation going on, then, some sort of, I'll just use the words in this particular case for this purpose, limited martial law, right? May not be inappropriate, right? Just to get the state out of a particular situation, as long as that need is met, and then we
what's
get
the
to a
principle?
certain point.
Like, if we could boil that sucker down into 12 words or less,
I'll try.
what would you
I'll let
say?
you count the words.
Ooh, I know it's tough. I'm not putting you on the spot.
We don't have enough food
Yep.
for our people.
Don't have
we have
Yep.
we have the land on which to produce that food.
Yep.
We need to use that land to make the food to feed all our people.
So can we say this is the it's tough. I know. I'm asking you to do stuff. Steve, I'm gonna punt to you. While I'm trying to think of how I would.
It's ironic for a subject you didn't want to talk about. I think you've already spoken more in this episode than you have in all the other episodes combined.
Duress is a funny thing, Trent. What kind of principle? What do you think? I'm not asking you to endorse this. I'm asking you to try and distill the spirit. What do you think was the intent?
Well, I think it was kind of like what Trent articulated. Like they saw a problem and they saw what to them was an obvious fix. Evidently, because presumably there was obviously land being underutilized, or at least from their point of view, being underutilized or misutilized, right? And so they saw this as an obvious fix. Land being underutilized, people going hungry, utilize land, feed the people. Right?
See, sorry, I don't want to interrupt. Like, I want to build on that.
Okay. Yeah, just okay. Go ahead.
Because to me, the unspoken questions to this are, because it seems to be implied that they're going to confiscate this land from someone. And therefore, so it's either some of the peasantry that they've doled this land out to, who are presumably using it, or I guess it might be one of those 23, some of those 23 hectares that,
Or
the
large,
original
yeah.
land, that which is more likely.
Yeah.
They're saying, okay, we've let you keep these 23 hectares, but if you're not using them for anything, we're going to take them away, give them to someone, right? And then, 8 years later, 8 years of red tape later, they're going to use that for the food, and everyone's going to have died of starvation in the meantime, anyways. But and so the other question becomes, for me, is like, okay, how is the the productivity of that land then distributed, right? Are they saying, okay, you've now worked that and you've created that food, and we're not taking the land away from you, but we are taking the food, and thanks very much.
Like, you see that? I don't know. I don't know.
Yeah.
Can we? Did the law say that? So far as I know, there was nothing in the bill of obligatory cultivation that fixed the prices of the produce of that land.
Yeah, so
I don't know. Now there may have been other legislation saying I don't know.
I'm going to take a broad leap at this point, and it's a very presumptive and I think a very giving. I'm giving them the benefit of the doubt here that if they were buying, if I heard it correctly, the government was buying the land from the landowners down to 23 hectares, and then
That was the agrarian reform law,
right, and
That was
giving
a
it
different
and giving
one.
it
This
to
is confiscation,
right, and giving it to the peasants,
Yeah.
right. So the government was buying it. So I'm kind of thinking, then the government would buy whatever was produced on that land to distribute it.
Okay. There's
Yeah.
two other
So we
issues
don't
with
really
that.
know if they were going to
We
buy
don't
that
know
stuff,
that's
or
the
they just wanted
Yeah.
to force more stuff to come to market.
In obligatory cultivation, there was no buying of land. It was just seized.
Confiscation.
It was just seized and then
Redistributed?
redistributed. Yeah, redistributed. If it was not being used for what the state considered to be arable purposes, and it made no difference as to what size it was. Now, it should also be noted, this is where I'm talking about the law of unintended consequences here. None of these legislators came from an agricultural background.
Right.
They were all intellectuals and urbanites.
Right.
So, and this is kind of the problem in that
Oh, you're okay.
there could be many reasons why.
Yeah, if you're
would-
rotating crops and
Yeah.
you're leaving one.
Yeah.
If I needed to leave it fallow for a while.
That's my next
Yep.
question is because
Yeah.
why was the land not being utilized?
Yeah.
Right. Simple. Because libertarian and conservatives usually
Yeah.
agree with this one. You got to figure out why this
Yeah.
thing is this way before you start doing it.
before you start making changes.
Before we take
It could also be that the land is of very negligible agricultural
Yeah.
use.
You can't plant
so-
wheat on rock.
Yeah, so the amount of inputs you would need to draw a crop ends up consuming more resources. Like, yeah, we could grow, say maybe, I'm just going to throw a number out there, 100 bushels of corn on this land. But I would consume in order for my workers to do this, we would consume the caloric equivalent of 107 bushels of corn to produce that, right? So I can see that as being a difficulty.
Well, if I'm not mistaken, it did specify arable land. So
But some arable, just because it's arable doesn't mean it's
So
bountiful,
you're right. Again,
Yeah.
that there's massive scope for error.
Yeah.
And in fact, there's scope for abuse too.
But can we say, can I throw this at you? Could I say that the principle behind it is that resources are held in common? I'm not saying I agree with it, and I'm not asking anyone to agree with it. But can we say that this is a principle that perhaps inspired the legislation, that the resources
Belong to everyone.
belong to everyone?
And by everyone, we mean the government.
No,
I didn't ask you to agree with it, Mr. Steve. I just asked.
I don't.
Yeah, no, I
Could we
understand.
say that this was
That's
the
probably a
possible
principle
motivation?
behind it.
Yeah.
I
For
don't.
better or for worse. I'm not asking. Was it a good idea? See, is it plausible that that's what they were intending?
Not as such. I disagree with
Okay.
that statement.
How would you tweak it?
I
How would
believe
you improve
at
it?
best, again, it depends on the actual intent and how it played out. And
That's
stuff
what I'm
like
asking.
that, right?
What was the intent?
I would say, again, we've got a crisis right now, right? So now we're talking about, okay, who is best placed morally, practically, whatever, to address and resolve this crisis to a positive resolution, right? So in this case, it's the government saying, we are, first of all, identifying this as a crisis. It is a bad thing that a whole bunch of people are starving. And we don't want our people to starve. We are responsible for them and to them. And so therefore, this is our solution for the moment as long as this crisis exists. Right? And I'm not necessarily, I don't think that they're saying that we have these things, these resources in common as such. It's just saying,
because they're coming from the Caballero. What was his name?
Caballero, he was the minister of labor.
he's from the government.
He's coming from the point of view that if you're not using the land for the purpose I approve of, me as the minister, and me as the government, or
Me as the state.
us as the state,
Yep.
his collection,
The
of,
royal we.
his collection of cohorts,
Yep.
that if you're not doing it for what I want you to use it for, or if you're not using it for what I want you to use it for, I'm going to take it and give it to someone who will. Or, well, they didn't really start a state farming apparatus, so it was
Again,
it was redistributive.
I don't think I'll be splitting hairs when I say it's, there's a difference between saying this is what I want you to use it for, and I'm ordering you to use it for, right? This isn't what I want you to. It's what your fellow citizens need you to use it for, right? And I think that distinction to me is what a lot of our conversations revolve around.
I see, and I'm thinking that's a distinction without a difference.
Okay, so could I
You don't think it's a
use
distinction?
could I use the Star Trek principle here,
Okay.
or the Spock principle? The needs of the many outweigh the needs of the one or the few. Could I say that is the inspirational principle behind the law of obligatory cultivation?
I won't argue with that.
You like that?
The needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few.
Yeah. That if the many are imperiled, like I'm not asking you to agree with it.
Yeah.
Saying, could this be a principle?
But I think
behind
I
this?
think your previous statement that this resource is of the commons.
Held in common. Yes.
Is held in common.
I think that's better.
I think it's better.
But Trent respectfully disagrees.
he does.
Well, the interesting, at this point, I'm kind of going, okay, what's the resource here? Is it the land or is it the output of the land? When we're saying this resource is held in common.
How do you think that plays a role?
Well, I'm not. Okay, on the one hand, I think it's kind of a two-edged sword in this context. So the one is, if you look at the resource as the output of the land,
Yeah.
right? You're saying, okay, this is the resource, and am I declaring it held in common? I guess I'm having problems adjusting to that, but let's go with that. Let's just say, okay,
See, my problem is just that the government has come to the point of saying we get to decide what it's used for.
Yep.
So
again,
I think that the government
Is nullifying the concept of property rights.
exactly right. Like
It's abrogating the property
it
rights.
doesn't matter. It's an emergency. If the government thinks that even if the government thinks that only an emergency we can do this, if they think we can do this in any circumstance whatsoever,
Well, define emergency.
well,
exactly.
Exactly. That's why controls need to be put in place. There absolutely has to be a feedback loop of faith and trust in the government, and and they're doing what they're saying, and why they're doing it, and how long they're going to do it for. Right. But again, I'll come back to, okay, if it's the resource is the output, then we're saying yes, that resource is in common. Maybe. Okay. Like I'm not arguing, but we need that resource right now. We need you to do that. Okay? We really appreciate you doing that, and maybe or maybe not we're paying you for it. I don't know.
Actually, now that I think about putting this all together, because as far as we know, they didn't redistribute. There wasn't a government marketing method. They weren't taking the produce.
Not that I know of.
Right. So then the land is the resource, not the output.
I guess maybe for the purposes of our discussion, we'd have to say that. Can I throw a cat in amongst your pigeons?
Yeah, absolutely.
You talked about like a feedback mechanism to make sure that these powers are not being abused.
Yeah.
Was there not a feedback mechanism already amongst the landowners? Was there not already these feedback mechanisms to prevent abuse amongst the agricultural aristocracy?
I don't know.
Why is it okay to entrust the state with powers that may be abused, yet not okay to trust the aristocracy?
Well,
with
the mere
powers
fact that
may
we're
be
having this
abused?
conversation, I think, points out why.
Just because the aristocracy had a track record of abusing.
Exactly.
Steve, has the state ever had a track record of abusing authority?
Yeah, once or twice.
Oh, okay. Just checking.
Well, getting back to the openings, well, there's no question about that, right? Usually right wings states, as far as I'm concerned.
Only right-wing states.
I said usually.
Sarcasm, forgive me, Trent. Sarcasm is the lowest form of wit.
No, it isn't actually.
Still funny.
I've always had a problem with that statement because Monty Python and Faulty Towers are two of the funniest shows on earth.
Sarcasm.
And there's nothing but irony and sarcasm.
Yeah. So I think, John Cleese would probably argue that point,
Yeah,
too.
okay.
Yeah.
All right, fair
Much
enough.
more articulated than any of them.
Fair
Yeah,
enough. Fair enough.
combined.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Do they abuse? Where were we?
Okay, I got another one for you.
I know.
This one is a little less controversial, but it comes with a tail that can be problematic.
Okay.
Wage disputes between landowners and laborers would go to a system of arbitration settled by committees with representatives from both parties.
Right.
Principle.
Sorry, repeat that again.
Wage disputes between landowners and laborers, would be settled by a system of arbitration through committees with representatives from both parties. So it's kind of like a collective bargaining thing, but where it's more like arbitration, binding arbitration.
Yeah, it's a combination of those two things. Now, it depends entirely on, I'd say, circumstances of the moment, and good faith on both the part of both parties. By circumstances of the moment, it might be like if the landowner has, all the crops are in or whatever, or
in a much
about to
stronger
be in or
position.
whatever.
Yeah.
It's like, fuck you guys, I only need half of this.
Or if they've got enough savings that they could wait out.
yeah.
Say, you know what, if we shut down the farm, I can make it.
Yeah.
What do you figure, Steve?
I think we're getting into a trade-offs thing now.
Okay, go on.
So the trade-off between like a binding arbitration model versus a collective bargaining model, there's pros and cons to both. I don't know if I can even list what those are. So for me, this is like one, okay, well, we have to try it and see how it works, and maybe we have to adjust it, right? Like I'm in favor. I'm even a libertarian. I'm not a pro-union. Personally, I'm not really a pro-union guy, but I do believe that people should be able to collectively bargain if they want.
Collectively bargain.
If they want to.
Yep. So what's the principle? Why would we, if we were the legislators who created this legislation, what would have been our motivation?
Well, presumably there's a pre-existence of disputes.
Sure.
Right.
But why, again, what's the principle?
Is to ensure fair wages, right? And again,
Or could I tweak it and say that disputes are resolved in a fair and transparent manner?
yeah,
Sure. This is an effort in that direction, I think. Yeah.
I actually remembered. I want to go back to the previous point you made. Have we known governments to abuse things? Well, absolutely we have, right? But the starting point, that was a counterpoint to the landowners in this case, abusing their power,
and really the whole system, or if the landowners had not abused their power, Republican Spain would never have existed.
Exactly. So for me, we circle back to your opening statements, which are essentially, when is the left useful? And I think in this case, everything we're talking about here is the intent, at least, is useful and is to address some very, very real issues that needed addressing.
But it can be right for abuse, right? So
Right.
to put this
Oh,
in a
there's
modern,
no question.
Oh, yeah.
it is
put for
right
a modern
abuse.
context, right? Like using California and property development in urban centers in California, right?
Don't look at it.
In the
Take that away from him.
in the
He was looking at his watch. He's
Yeah.
trying to get out of here.
and now it's making noise.
Yeah.
That wasn't mine.
That's probably mine.
But in an effort to
Mine's on mute.
to like empower stakeholders, right, or give every stakeholder a voice, like it's in the method of like property development, like they've essentially instituted a heckler's veto.
What is that?
That's where anybody who wants to raise an objection
Oh,
can
gotcha.
completely
I'm sorry.
derail.
I'm
We literally saw that with Energy East.
Yes.
We saw that with Energy
Yes.
East.
Yes.
There was an example that Reason cited a number of times. They did a couple of videos on it of this guy in San Francisco. He had a property that was a single story. And he was using it as a laundromat, or he was a monk. He wanted to keep the laundromat.
I think I've heard of this.
And build up 7 stories of housing
Right. Yeah, I've
in a
heard of
place with a massive housing shortage.
this. Right.
Right. And so going through the process of approval, and he gets to what do they call the Board of Trustees or something?
Something like that, yeah.
Anyway, the Board of Supervisors, sorry. Right.
Yeah. Some mechanism of municipal government. Yeah.
And it was the Board. So Board of Supervisors is actually like their city council.
Yeah, that's right. Municipal government. Yeah.
And so then all of a sudden there was all these protests
Yeah.
from around him, essentially people who own property and didn't want their property values to go down.
Yeah.
Right, it's
Yeah.
a bunch of NIMBYism, but in a city with a massive amount of with a massive housing shortage, highest property values in the United States outside of like Manhattan, and so he's trying to build like low income housing,
Right.
and it couldn't happen, and essentially because of the heckler's veto, right? Like,
What-
building housing isn't unmitigated.
It's a good.
It's a
Yes,
good.
it's a good.
Right?
But
There's a need.
Yeah.
And now there's this.
Well,
heckler's
and
veto.
I think
So this system
yeah.
is just like without knowing how it was going to be structured, just saying,
Yeah.
okay, we
Yeah.
need we need to hear from all the stakeholders, but there's trade-offs in how you do that about whether you have a system that functions or a system that just empowers the heckler's veto.
And if it's and it needs to.
So
be,
that's my point. The whole
Sometimes things need to be adaptive, but I think this is again. Now we get to some broader philosophical points,
Well,
right?
and this is it.
When we talk about the Spockism,
Yeah.
right? The needs of the many versus the needs of the few, and everyone who
Yep.
saw that in the movie, right?
At the time, they were like, "Oh, yeah,
it's
that's great.
heroic. It makes
That's great
sense, right?
stuff. Yep.
And as a sentiment,
Yeah.
it always makes sense,
Well,
unless
this is why-
you're one of the few.
This
in
is
which
why
case,
I'm asking you guys not to judge these on their efficacy. I'm asking you to find the principle.
yeah.
Right? Okay, so now
This is
we're-
weird. This is
we're
weird. You being
really-
here, okay? You know,
I'm being the devil's advocate.
you absolutely are,
or
and
I'm being Lenin's advocate.
No, I think it's more Trotsky's. Up to a point.
Oy vey. Okay, now we're getting sticky. Back to the Agrarian Reform Law of 1932. This was the most radical.
I thought we already did that one.
Well, we started, and then you got into
okay,
it,
now-
and I asked, I said, sorry, instead of starting you right at the difficult part,
Okay.
I wanted to walk back to 10,000 feet,
Okay.
low resolution where it's easy, and then get difficult.
Okay.
This is the one where anything under 23 hectares of land was exempt. Anything over could be forcibly purchased by the state, so not a voluntary transaction, a compulsory transaction.
Yeah, I mean that was the only way to do it.
And well, no, not necessarily. Given to peasants in the intent that they would farm themselves out of poverty.
Right.
However, it was poorly written, poorly executed, lots of abuse. Please set that aside. What is the principle?
Well, it's in this case, it is a literal redistribution of wealth, and as we've specifically said, wealth is actually measured in terms of land ownership.
In this case, yes. Yeah. It was just one of the many ways that wealth can be measured.
And I think the principle here is that it was justified. The redistribution of wealth, and it was so, the concentration of wealth was in this case so ridiculously held by such a minority that this was the only way to do it, and the poverty of the peasants involved was so.
So what is the principle behind redistribution of wealth? If redistribution of wealth is the what is the why?
To make the impoverished, give them a chance, right? Now all of a sudden, and now they are contributing to the economy as individuals as opposed to part of someone else's something, and they are able to, now they have purchasing power within that economy to actually.
So is this an
Participate.
extension of the principle of societal equality?
I feel, knowing it's you, I'm always leery
You're all,
of
I know,
answering
I
things.
know,
You're like, wait a minute.
and
You're sucking me into something, but I'm going to say yes.
I know, and it's terrible.
Yes.
I'm asking you to forget everything you know about me.
I agree with that statement wholeheartedly.
And
I
again,
think
I'm
that
not
is-
asking you to agree to this, guys. I'm not asking you to sign off on that principle and say whether or not you personally agree. What I'm asking is it plausible that maybe that was their principle?
Yes.
That
I
they were
believe
signing
I
off
believe
of.
that to be the case.
That I know, and this is really loaded language, and I'm going to apologize in advance. I just don't know any other way to say it. That maybe the principle was equality of result, and I'm not asking you to say that was a laudable good. Is it plausible that they thought in 1932? Did they think that was a laudable good?
That
Was
equality of
that a
outcome.
legitimate, in their eyes, a legitimate principle?
That they thought equality of outcome was a legitimate
Yeah.
thing. Yeah, probably.
Could
I
we
could
say
see
that?
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, I don't know. We obviously can't read their minds. but-
Right. Yeah, we
but
don't
yes.
know their mind. Yeah.
I would say, probably in 1932, that the understanding of trying to achieve equality of outcome.
And
Because
this is important.
It's
That's
disputed
right.
today.
That's right.
Right?
But we have 100 years of history
Yeah.
of data and attempt
That they didn't have, for sure.
that they did not have.
Right.
Well, and I
And it wasn't the Soviet Union at the time,
Mm-hmm.
just as that example.
Yeah.
Because it was not necessarily viewed. It was still
It was
very
in
much
its
viewed,
infancy.
and it was still very much viewed as a viable project.
Right. Because, again, nobody knew.
Nobody knew what the outcomes.
Nobody knew
we
what
were
was
still
going
working
on.
the outcomes.
That's right.
And nobody knew that Stalin was.
I mean, it had only been around, 1921 was the end of the Civil War? 21, 22?
21, 22,
Yeah.
yeah.
So, yeah, it was still in its infancy.
yeah.
And again, it wasn't like you could just
And it,
pull
had,
up
and it had
YouTube.
lots of apologists. And,
Yeah,
And there,
there was very little information coming
Yeah.
out of that. So that was not an example that was on the table.
I'm going to step away from a full blown.
well, and even at the time, it wouldn't have been considered a failure.
That's right.
Right,
It was in its infancy.
Yeah.
Equality of outcome. Like I'm not, because again, I want to step away from the red under the bed thing. I've always loathed people who say, Democrat is Spanish Republican, is socialist, is communist, and is therefore needs to be thrown out of helicopters, right? So equality of outcome, I don't think the purpose was full equality of outcome, because we've got Republicans, we've got socialists, we've got liberal Democrats.
You got a large coalition.
Right.
Yeah.
So there's a whole bunch of people. That not all of them are going, well, everyone has to be equal here. Right. What it was a leveling of the playing field to a bare minimum. We're defining the baseline for all of our constituency at this point. Right. So that's what it's saying. Because I don't think there's any way of saying that the equality of outcome is what's at play here. If we're taking all but 23 hectares of land away from the landowner, and we're distributing those amongst X number of peasants,
Then what's a better formulation?
None of those peasants is going to come out
Right.
equal to
Yeah.
that landowner.
In order for equality of outcome to be a guiding principle,
Yeah.
you have to have a very broad idea of outcome.
And that's why I think in this case, the outcome is, again, it's a baseline to start from, to operate from, and that, you get the same sort of opportunity. Like equality of outcome in this case is like saying, any child can grow up to be the president of the United States. That's the equality of outcome, right? The opportunity is there, not necessarily the starting point.
Or so it's equality of opportunity.
That's what
Which
I
is kind
say.
of what we identified with the universal franchise.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Universal franchise, and again, it's establishing a baseline.
But this
It's saying-
goes a little bit further on that track.
Yeah, I'm just thinking if you're talking about the broad definition of quality, it is probably their idea of a quality of outcome was just everybody knows where their next meal is coming from.
Yeah. Like I was saying,
And
let's
that's a
not.
laudable goal.
That's why I'm trying to like,
Baseline.
Yeah, I'm asking you guys to really distill this down
Yeah.
to principles. Let's set aside efficacy. Let's set aside the emotional charged baggage that comes with that term in 2024 language.
Yeah.
And try and understand, what was the principle that they wanted to achieve?
Well, and for me also, there's the outcome. The intent and the outcome are also to be measured against the pre-existing conditions.
And
right?
you know what? I'm going to go even further. I'll say, set aside the outcome. Just show me what's in the heart.
Right. Well,
That's all I wanna know.
That's the problem I've always had with anti-Castroism and stuff like it's like, okay, great, hate Castro, hate Cuba, hate communism,
Hate beards.
right?
Don't hate Cuba. Cuba's nice, but
Hate beer.
Castro.
Hate Castro.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you can hate Castro plenty.
But I will always argue that Castro was better for Cubans than Batista was, right? So likewise here, I'm never going to claim that the Republic was perfect, especially after the Civil War started and it fell apart, and the Stalinists came in and usurped everything.
Okay, so again, it gets stickier as we go. The church, which ran schools and charities, in other words, social relief, was abolished from those. I don't have the name of this legislation. Was abolished from these activities. What's the name of the? What? Oh my God! Okay, Manuel. That's the name of the guy. Okay, sorry. Was abolished from these activities. Specifically schools, even though the state at the time of this legislation had no mechanism for charity and education. They attempted to build 7,000 schools very quickly, and they increased enrollment by 50,000, but their ability to implement it obviously was kind of just, it wasn't up to the task. So again, I'm going to ask you to set aside the efficacy. I'm going to ask you to set aside the mechanism. I'm going to ask you to set aside the implementation. When we say the church may not be involved in charity and schools, what's the principle?
I'm going to assume that the church was not providing those benefits universally. Right? Like if you were not Catholic, which, I mean, like, so it's like 90% of Spain at the time was probably Catholic,
I'd
right?
say 99.
If you
99
weren't-
change.
If you weren't a good Catholic.
But if you weren't a good Catholic or whatever, I'm assuming there were some restrictions on.
I'm also going to say that it was probably the church-run schools. If you could afford your own private schools, if you were a wealthy industrialist or landowner, you went to private school.
Probably, yeah.
So the church-run schools were for the majority of the population. They were for the working and agrarian class.
And they probably were, the church was resistant to teaching maybe what the people in the Republican government wanted them to teach.
Okay, what's the principle on there? Formulate that into a principle. If we're talking about control over curriculum.
I don't know.
Trent, in our hour of need, we look to you.
I'm actually looking for. I mentioned before that there was a quote that I had come across. That was like, because what you're talking about is very interesting. You're talking about this at the beginning of the Republic.
Yes.
What I read yesterday, I'm struggling to find it right now, is that actually in the interim, while the Catholic Church had a history of providing social charity and education, and was seen in a relative light, at least, as positive, that changed and became very repressive and those benefits to the poorer classes
Where it became seen as somewhat negligible.
became negligible, right? At the
Right.
in order to.
But again-
so I've been looking for that.
Again,
right?
I'll give you a quote from Manuel Azaña, who was one of the principal.
Manuel Azani, he's the
yep.
man.
Very interesting character.
Yeah.
One of the principal authors of this legislation. He said, quote, "Do not tell me that this is contrary to freedom. It is a matter of public health," end quote. Now, that has no relevance to anything. I just thought it was really cool. Again, I'm asking you to set aside the efficacy of this. Mm-hmm. What is the principle? When we say the church may not provide social relief, a social safety net, or education, that this must be done by the state, what is our principle?
Because I think at this time now we're talking. The church is controlled from Rome, and
Okay, so what?
so it's extra national,
Okay. So it's not accountable to us.
right? So that's
Okay.
part of it, and has shown itself to be hostile to forces of reform, and has the power to exert that moral authority, and has been
Okay.
over people. So
So we definitely have our principle of we want accountability in these things. There's something of there's a flavor of efficacy in there.
Is this also a separation of church and state thing?
I'd say so.
Maybe
Right?
because again, what if you're not Catholic? If I mean, I maybe I'm extrapolating a little bit here, but I'm going to throw a dart here and say that a Catholic church-run school is probably going to be education provided within a Catholic context.
Yes.
Absolutely.
So if I am Jewish, Islamic, Protestants, Zoroastrian, whatever, if I do not fit the template of Catholicism, and let's go even further, the very specific, what we talked about, fundamentalist brand of Catholic Catholicism. Say I am the child of a German, Bavarian German Catholic. My style of Catholicism is far less fundamentalist. So is that a principle in there? That education should be neutral. It should not be religiously... separation of church, separation of the secular and the religious.
I think so. I mean, I don't think there's any arguing.
But
You know, like,
also I guess a acknowledgement of the primacy of the state over religion.
Can you distill that down further? Why? What is the principle behind the primacy of the state?
Well, it's like because you always state.
And put it in the best possible light that you can.
Oh, I don't know if I can.
Yes, you can. Find a way.
you're measuring it against religion, so the bar is low here.
We're helping you here.
Room full of atheists.
Like if you had to sell this, if you got to steel man this,
How do we do that? So now the Republicans. This is a democratic institution.
at the time,
At
yes.
the time, right?
At the time.
So a lot of trying to steelman it because I don't have a lot of hard time. For example, Oliver Wendell Holmes, and Earl Warren was to this way. They both felt that the principles of the Supreme Courts, of the courts of
Those guys were Supreme Court justices.
they were
in
both
the United States.
Chief Justices
Justices
of the United
on
States,
the Supreme
and they both shared to a certain extent. People argue, but Holmes probably most distilled this in that the state. They didn't think that the Constitution should really have much of a restriction on the powers of Congress because the Congress was democratically elected, and therefore they were represent what the people wanted.
Right.
People should get what they want.
Right.
So I kind of feel like that principle was probably there in the Republicans.
Okay.
The people in there felt
That-
that we're here democratically.
Right. So that the state should have primacy. An elected institution that is accountable to the people should have primacy over a non-elected, unaccountable institution.
Exactly. Whether that institution is a
Right.
court
Are you
or
cool
a
with
government.
that?
Yeah.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
and I think actually that's how the Republic came to be. Because there's no arguing that, the majority of Spaniards were Catholics. We're not talking Zoroastrians and a whole bunch of the Jewish faith
Yeah, I
and
don't
the
think there was
Islamic
a lot of
faith.
them.
Right? So we're still dealing with a bunch of Catholics who nonetheless were looking for reform, political reform, economic reform, industrial reform, however you want to look at it. So that to me speaks to exactly what you were talking about. That is, so as soon as it went to a republic and an elected body, right, that wish was being spoken for, right?
Damn it! I didn't. Can I borrow this?
Yeah.
Okay, no. I'll leave it. I'll set it aside.
At the same time,
Write it down somewhere. You're going to forget.
So the
We're a
people,
room full of attention deficit people here. So
You're not kidding.
the people,
write it out, tear a page, whatever you want.
Wait, I'm gonna put it on this one.
Put it on the clean page.
the
If you're
people
gonna take it.
have created a body that represents their interests, and they're saying, yes, we want you people to take care of us, represent us, and we trust you to do that, right? And we trust you to do that one way or another. We trust you to do that more than the church,
Yeah.
right? The church itself has been implicated. It is very, very strongly linked to the politics of law and order, of reaction, of conservatism, of the status quo, right? And the status quo was not a healthy one. And so I think that's what's playing out in this case. Have I commented on the fact that you're a lefty before?
Yes, once or twice.
Have I really?
Yep.
You a lefty?
Yep.
I was started off as a lefty and then
He was beaten out of
And
you.
your dad
beaten
beat it
me.
out of you?
No, not my dad. It was my first grade teacher.
Oh, wow. All right.
So can I say that?
So you're an honorable left.
As I'm gonna. Can I put that down as the principle then that institutions that are accountable, democratic, and accountable to the people should take primacy over institutions that are not.
Say it again.
Institutions that are democratically accountable to the people should take primacy over institutions that are not.
I'd say yes.
Okay, I'm going to put that down.
I'm going to have to wrap this up in 5, guys. I'm sorry. And I think we're
Yep.
going to have another episode on this. Sorry, Steve.
Evidently.
That's the last of the legislation that I've really got here. So I think we've nailed down 4 principles behind all of this. Maybe 5. The first was equality among individuals. The second was equality of opportunity. The third was disputes must be resolved in a open, fair, and transparent manner.
Sorry, back up. When we quality of outcome, not equality of opportunity.
No, I didn't say that.
We didn't say
I
equality
thought
of
we
outcome.
no.
I
we were
said
saying the
equality of opportunity.
I'll
I'll get to that one later. Don't you worry. Equality. I'm starting from what had broad and universal agreement,
Right.
and then I'm going to move to the sticky as we go. Equality among individuals.
right.
Equality of opportunity.
Okay.
The resolution of disputes between individuals and groups, I'm inserting that, must be fair,
And transparent.
open, and transparent.
Yeah. And in good faith. Yeah, fair.
Yeah. Last, institutions that are democratically accountable to the people take primacy over institutions that are not. And what I mean by institutions are societal institutions that are mandatory. In other words, education, hospitals, charities, transportation, this sort of thing. The last one, and that's where we get sticky, was equality of the principle of equality of outcome. And that depends a lot on how broad do you define the outcome. So that one was sticky. That was a little controversial. That was a little undefined as to where we got in there. Can we say that those were the 4 principles that if I look at those, and like for sure 4, maybe the 5th, set it aside, but those 4, can I say that is the left at its finest?
Well, I would say I would add a 5th and a half in there, which is the baseline.
What's that?
A baseline of not just dignity of life, but life.
What does that mean?
Well,
Can you just distill that down? Can you
just some basic conditions? Yes, you can. You can have a roof over your head. It might be some certain amount of sanitation and health and food and
isn't that kind of like inequality of outcome?
No,
A very broadly defined outcome?
Again, that's I suppose somewhere between equality of opportunity and equality of outcome. I don't think equality of outcome is achievable.
Well, not absolute equality of outcome,
Right.
but you're talking about a certain level, a certain minimum standard, a certain...
Exactly. So,
Something.
but if someone's above that, then that's not equality. That's why I say equality of opportunity. You set a baseline. You say, okay, this is what we expect for our people, right? And it ain't what we had under you guys.
So if we're talking about a journey, there's the finish line, the midpoint, and the start line. Where is equality more, like, is it equally important across all three of those zones, or does it vary? Share with me your vision.
I'd say the starting point.
Okay. So when we say, okay, but everybody should have like a certain minimum level of housing. Everybody should have a certain minimum level of caloric nutrition. Everybody should have a certain minimum level of education, medical care. We're talking like basic, like hierarchy.
Sanitation,
Yep.
and everything that Reg lists.
Is that finish line or is that start line?
That's start line.
What do you think, Steve? Is that finish line or is that start line? Or is that midpoint?
Yeah, it depends on how you're measuring it.
Say it again. So
If you're the Spanish Republic in 1931,
yeah, it can't be the start point.
it can't be a start point, but it's your defined. This is our immediate goal.
Yeah. So it's an equality of outcome that we want. We want a very minimum outcome.
Yeah.
We don't want an absolute outcome.
Okay.
We want a bare minimum outcome. So let me put that. It's equality of minimal outcome. So those 5 principles. What I'd like to do next time is then let's apply these 5 principles to the world of today. Specifically, how it affects like what we're seeing in the United Kingdom, what we're seeing within our own country, and how it relates to our. I mean, we are in a world that is just it is the creation of the progressive vision right now, and that all our institutions, our governance, what we consider the Overton window, is defined by that experience of the 100 years roughly that came since the early 1930s, when those principles were for the first time, really for the first time, put into place. Or not put into place, championed.
Well, I mean, yeah, I'll leave it for next time. Let that be the opening statement to next time.
It's on record. We'll just record it, play it again.
I was thinking for the opening song for next time, tongue in cheek. So I was going to say there's Billy Bragg singing the International. We could do that.
Okay.
Right. But there's also, I don't know if you remember.
Dirty Old Town by the Pogues.
The original.
Okay, that was my go-to.
The original South Park movie had a takeoff on the song from Les Mis at the Barricades.
Yeah.
That would be a
Isn't
great
that
song to
Le
open.
Marseillaise?
No, it's
Presumably, it's not Blame Canada.
no, but actually they throw in a montage, a medley of the other songs in the background. And stuff
All right.
like that.
There we go.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Talk to you later.
Thank you, Steve.